All right, so who is a fan of C.S. Lewis? All of us, yay! And if you aren't, I hope you will be one. Not that he's perfect. He's very, he was very much a part of his time in terms of some of his beliefs, and I've had people say, oh, he's just not inclusive at all of women, and it's true, he's not. So you kind of have to overlook a lot of the stuff that really dates him, but I have had a profound experience interacting with C.S. Lewis's writings. I'm sure many of you have. Tell me some of your favorite books of C.S. Lewis.
Mere Christianity.
Mere Christianity.
The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe.
Joy.
Not science fiction. That was
The science fiction trilogy, Surprised by Joy. Yeah. Here, I'll jog your memory. Maybe I can make you have us look at it, and then we'll be okay. There's some more. The Great Divorce, Grief Observed, right? All these are God in the Dock is a good one. Screw Tape Letters. We've read a few of C.S. Lewis books in adult education over the last few years. So many good ones. So I wanted to tell you, I thought it would be fun is just to start out telling you a little bit more about his life, his background, because he's such an interesting person. But would somebody mind closing that door? It's really loud with the choir. Okay. So C.S. Lewis, his name is, does anybody know what C.S. stands for? Live Staples, that's right. And he was just known as Jack by all of his friends. They just called him Jack. Like I mentioned, he's best-selling author. He's been called one of the most influential, if not the most influential theologian of the 20th century. He is been referred to as a Christian for all Christians. Impressive titles, right? And his children's books, like the Chronicles of Narnia, were made into blockbuster movies as his fame, has continued to grow. So I'm actually planning to read. I'm trying to figure out the age my children can be. My younger two, to read his Narnia series and then watch the movies because they're very well done. Anyway. He's got these titles, and it's interesting because he's often claimed by the evangelicals in the church as one of theirs, even though, okay, first of all, he was an Anglican, Church of England, number one. He believed that truth was revealed in other religions, not just Christianity. He took a very critical historical view of the Bible. And he also lived with a woman, if you didn't know, a little gossip, for 30 years who he wasn't married to. So, okay, but he is remarkable, and he strove to write only about those things that really all Christians hold in common. That was part of the goal he was striving for, because he really wasn't interested in arguing about denominational, differences or non-essentials of the faith, as he would talk about it. He wanted to draw people together. He wanted to draw people of faith together in a unified way. And so his approach, I think, was very intentionally the middle way, like we do in Anglicanism, the via media. This was very important to him. And I think it reveals his sort of Anglican flavor through and through by being sort of a bridge to people on all sides of the church. So, we're claiming him as ours. Thank you very much, you Anglican, but he was for all people. A poll was taken at I went to a private Christian school undergraduate, and they asked all the students and it was very diverse in terms of denominations, who the most influential writer, just any writer. And C.S. Lewis was chosen by an overwhelming majority of the students. And so I have a theory. One of my professors didn't like my theory, but I'll tell you my theory, because I wrote a paper about it. But I've written quite a few papers on Lewis's theology. But I really believe that even though, he was a product of sort of modernism, that his approach was more of a postmodern, that he was sort of on the cutting edge of sort of understanding. I think he was able to really reach out to the generations to come, because he was kind of moving forward in his own thinking. particularly in a prophetic way in talking about myth, the importance of myth. And it's so important to, in postmodernism, mythology is extremely important. I mean, we see and understand truth through mythology, through myths in ways that, not such literal ways. And so he really embraced that. Lewis was born in 1898 in Belfast, Ireland. His family was very bookish. They were middle class, very Victorian, pretty typical Anglicans at the time. They were well educated. They had a huge library. But Lewis had a difficult childhood. His mother died when he was only 8 years old. And it was just a huge loss. It really impacted him. And his father was a very withdrawn man. And when his wife died, he became even more withdrawn. And so he had a very lonely and difficult childhood. And he suffered a lot with a sense of loss. And his brother Warnie and him would pass the time by really living in their imaginations. That's kind of how they survived and made it through childhood with each other. They would create these complex lands and stories with very magical creatures and animals. By the way, Lewis is the middle of the three boys there in the picture.
Yeah.
Just very difficult. So Lewis described in his autobiography called Surprised by Joy, he describes his earliest experiences, though, despite that suffering, he would have these, what he called, quote, stabs of joy. These just stabs of joy that would come. He just hurt, just hit his heart, and it would be so wonderful. He went to boarding school. I think that's him and his brother there. He went to boarding school at age 15. And while he was there, he continued to have quite a bit of suffering that he had to get through. There were, apparently, several schoolmasters that were what we would call very abusive, just very abusive with him. And he never definitively said what happened, but it had some really, really negative effects on him. So much so that his response to a lot of that was to become an atheist. He just felt, he'd suffered so much. Where was God? Right? He just couldn't figure out how to reconcile God with the suffering that he had. So as a teenager, he decided he moved out completely from the idea of faith and declared himself an atheist. And he was to really become a staunch atheist. He'd really hold fast to that for quite a while in his life. So he at age 20, he enters Oxford. But he has to leave because he was called to fight in World War I. And it was very, very difficult for Lewis. He was actually wounded in action, and he returned to England, and then he was able to return to Oxford a year later. I mean, he recovered, but again, substantial suffering in his life. And at Oxford, he had a reputation. Let's see, here's a picture of him. Handsome young man.
You lost it.
Did I lose it?
It keeps going.
Yeah, you know what? There's a connection comes and goes, but I don't know why. Sorry. So he had this reputation for being very argumentative, but he still would excel in his studies, particularly of English literature. Really acting funny now. Huh?
It's just
Sorry. So he became a fellow of Magdalen College. I think that's him at that stage. And he became the professor of English literature, and he held that post for 3 decades, for 30 years. So this was really, a driving passion for him. And while he was, at Oxford, he became very close friends with a group of scholars. Anybody know what that group was called?
Inklings.
The Inklings. Who can name? Let me just full screen that because that's fun. Who could name? The members of that.
Williams.
What was that?
Williams.
Charles Williams.
Tolkien.
Yeah, they are Tolkien and Hugo Dyson. They are. And wouldn't you just love to sit in a pub and hear these conversations? I mean, really, these guys were really, really close. What's interesting is that they were Christians, except for Lewis at the time. He was claiming to be an atheist. Tolkien as a Roman Catholic, and Charles and Hugo Dyson were very devout Anglicans. And, of course, and they even wrote about this and talked about their faith. So there were others that kind of came into this group here and there, but Lewis was just a very outspoken atheist. So this was, of course, good for argument and debate. I'm sure they would gather to read books, they'd critique each other's writings, they would discuss them, over their beer and cigars at the local pub. And the relationship that Lewis forms with his fellow Inklings proved to be one of the most important and influential, things in his whole life. And ultimately, of course, he started to find his faith in atheism to be shaken. He writes this: a young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. And he talks about this, that he would have like crises of faith as an atheist, like maybe he was wrong, maybe there was a God, and then you go, no, it can't be. But I think they worked on him. they whittled away and worked on and argued out these issues of faith with him. Again, I love to hear those conversations. In 1931, though, he had what he calls sort of a mystical experience. He was riding a double-decker bus, and he had a vision of some kind. And I don't know the details. I don't think he explained, but he talks about when I got on the bus, I didn't believe, and when I got off the bus, I did. Right? And he became convinced not just of God's existence, but even of Jesus' role as the Son of God, that he was connecting with Jesus on that bus as well. So it's very interesting. And he says he actually experienced, though, numerous conversions in his ideology in becoming a Christian. It was still a process for him. He said, my own progress had been from what he called popular realism or atheism to philosophical idealism, from idealism to pantheism, from pantheism to theism, and from theism to Christianity. Kind of a long road for him to get back. Although you see, he's kind of returning to the faith of his childhood. In an instrumental conversation towards about his conversion that he had with his friends, Tolkien and Hugo Dyson, they were walking, he says, through the paths around Magdalen College in Oxford. They were talking about mythology. Of course, this is Lewis's love. Talking about mythology. And Lewis says something. He says, well, all myths are beautiful lies. How we put it. And he's challenged by Tolkien. Yeah. Tolkien says, no. And this is what he says. Myths are not lies. Man is not ultimately a liar. He may pervert his thoughts into lies, but he comes from God. And it is from God that he draws his ideals. Not merely the abstract thoughts of man, but also his imaginative inventions must originate with God, and in consequence reflect something of eternal truth. In making a myth, in practicing the mythopoeia and peopling the world with elves and dragons and goblins, a storyteller is actually fulfilling God's purpose and reflecting a splintered fragment of true light. So Lewis records this conversation, and he writes that the two men in this conversation showed him, this is what he writes, quote, the story of Christ is simply a true myth. A myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference that really happened. All the pagan stories of God expressing himself through the minds of poets, using such images as he found there, while Christianity is God expressing himself through what we call real things. This is what he begins to feel and think. He says he then considers himself, quote, the most reluctant convert in all of England. But Lewis's conversion dramatically changes his life and his academic focus. And his writing then starts to become more and more about Christian literature, becoming pretty quickly well known as a Christian speaker and writer. The penalty for this is that he suffered tremendous rejection in academia for this. Remember now, the teaching is at the climax of this post-Enlightenment modernism, right, in academia. And so there's so much pressure to reject supernaturalism, and it's just, supernaturalism is considered so extreme. And so if one's being taken seriously, really we couldn't delve into this. And so I don't know, I wonder if that's still a little bit true in some ways, but in 1941, Lewis begins doing broadcasts on the BBC. This just takes off. He's also doing talks for the Royal Air Force bases. They call them spiritual talks, and his popularity just soars. He was then deluged with letters from all these listeners who were hearing him on the radio. And actually, we don't realize one of his most comprehensive forms of ministry was letter writing, because he would endeavor to write back to everybody who wrote to him, especially children. And his books just take off in sales, and he really becomes really one of the most popular Christian writers of his time. I like that book. You look at him reading his books. In 1947, Time magazine featured a cover story on Lewis after he published his book on miracles. And the article was to marvel at the risk of his heresy in academia, to claim that there was some reality that was supernatural. He really put himself out there. I don't think we realize how much he put himself out there for this, because we know him as popular, right? The troubles that Lewis faced in academia didn't seem to dim his passion, though. He continued to be a prolific writer and speaker. And in 1954, he moved to take the chair of medieval and Renaissance literature at Magdalene College at Cambridge, his rival, where he remained there until 1963. So, as we know, in 1950, he begins to write fiction, his fictional works that were first published in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is, of course, the first book for the Chronicles of Narnia. It was immediately very popular. The final book in the series, The Last Battle, actually won the Carnegie Medal when it was published in 1956. So these books have been, well loved, beloved, for many years. Although he had a few relationships, significant relationships. I'm so sorry, it looks so ugly. You can see that all the edits and everything. Anyway. He meets somebody really important. Yeah, no, I know how to do it, but actually, could you do it so that I can still see the slides?
Oh,
It's Google Slides.
yeah, I know. So if you do this.
Yeah, I can do that, and then I can't see when I'm. Sorry. Thank you for helping me. You know what I mean? I don't know why it won't show me both versions.
It's not a Mac. That's what
It's not a Mac. Yeah, it's a problem.
That is the problem.
Brain's fried.
Okay.
We love each other by the 100 years old. You're not finished. You would sit on our side.
So Lewis had relationships with other women, but he became kind of a convinced bachelor at some point. He was like, bachelor life this is it. I'm good. I don't need. But then he meets somebody. Does anybody know her name? Joy Davidman Gresham in 1952. They met because initially they corresponded in the mail for 2 years. And she was an American Jew from New York. Joy was a bright and extremely outspoken woman, a divorcee, and a smoker and drinker just like him. She was someone Lewis felt what he called was his intellectual equivalent. and he falls hard for her, really hard in love with her. And he's just never the same. Of course, we know they get married in a civil ceremony. And in part, they were doing this to protect her from being extradited back to the US. But, and so they have this incredible relationship, but here's a picture of them a little later on. But in 1957, she's diagnosed with cancer. And the two, decided to then have a religious ceremony because they've done the civil ceremony. And they just wanted something, they wanted God in the middle of this relationship and this marriage. And at the hospital bedside wedding, the Reverend Peter Bide prayed for her healing. And then her cancer went into remission for quite a few more years after that. However, as we know, she does ultimately die several years later in 1960 with a quote, "at peace with God." And, for Lewis, this is just, obviously beyond devastating, but he describes it as the very most difficult thing he'd ever faced. His heart-wrenching struggle and grief at the loss of his wife also renews a faith crisis in him. Here's actually I found the article, and it describes him and her death at the time. And here's the, sorry, that wasn't what I meant to do. Sorry, never mind that, forget me. Yeah, so it just really, really changes him. He struggles with God, and he starts to really, all that theology he has to wrestle with, about what childhood theology, what he's learned. How does he make sense of, again, this level of suffering? It was just like, why? She's a wonderful woman. There's no need for that, just all those things that a lot of us can relate to, this loss. And he's so angry at God, and he moves through this, and he moves towards a journey of healing. Of course, it's not quick, but he writes A Grief Observed, and he writes just really in depth. And he also wrote another book, The Problem of Pain, which was not as personal, not as intimate in terms of really dealing with suffering the way A Grief Observed does. And that book has just brought comfort to so many people in times of grief, to relate to the way he wrestles and it just very honestly struggles with faith and God and this kind of suffering. So then he dies in 1960. Oh, no, sorry. He retires from Cambridge and he dies that same year, the end of the year, November 22nd, 1963. Kind of just see like his life is kind of quickly wrapped up at that. And it's remarkable because the day that he died was the same day as Kennedy's assassination and the same day that Aldous Huxley died as well. There's actually a free book. It's not that good. I don't recommend it, but we read it in college. But it was called Between Heaven and Hell. And the writer tries to say what was the conversation between Kennedy and Lewis and Huxley at Heaven's Gates, waiting to go in, and how interesting it would have been to make different, the problem was the guy wasn't a very good writer. So everything he wrote was like, C.S. Lewis could have said that 10 times better. But anyway, in 1963, so they have his funeral and he is buried. And I guess I don't know, has anybody been to his burial site? I don't know where this is actually. It looks beautiful. But he wasn't a saint in the way that we think of it, right? He was just a very human person. He had really obvious flaws, but he was extraordinary in his faith. He loved God and his fellow people. And he really cared, So thinking about more of his longer term influence, here's, we can talk about this quote. I love this, but you really start to see some of his theology that's taken hold through his fiction. I mean, in Mere Christianity, that changed my life when I read that book as a young person. But you really can kind of hear the theology reflected in his fiction. The preface to Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he writes, someday you will be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. And so as it's mentioned, Lewis becomes a Christian through this love of men, particularly, and I love this about him, it was through the Norse and pagan myths. He viewed the story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection as the ancient myth that had become reality. The dying and rising God of the pagans is now, he considers, a fact in Christ. And he writes in God in the Dock, the heart of Christianity is a myth which is also a fact. The old myth of the dying God, without ceasing to be myth, comes down from the heaven of legend and imagination to the earth of history. It happens at a particular date, in a particular place, followed by definable historical consequences. We pass from a Balder or an Osiris dying nobody knows when or where, to a historical person crucified, it's all in order, under Pontius Pilate. He says, by becoming fact, it does not cease to be myth. That is a miracle. God is more than God, not less. Christ is more than Balder, not less. We must not be ashamed of the mythical radiance resting on our theology. We must not be nervous about parallels or pagan Christs. They ought to be there. It would be a stumbling block if they weren't. We must not, in false spirituality, withhold our imaginative welcome. If God chooses to be mythopoeic, and is not the sky itself a myth, shall we refuse to be mythopathic? So he just encourages us to just embrace this, right? And I love it, of course, thinking about interfaith dialogue and connectivity, he sees paganism as our sister, in faith in many ways. He says it's intricately interconnected to Christianity. I mean, we know it is historically, but also theologically with our shared myth. In this sense, paganism is not the enemy or adversary of Christianity, it's the precursor, it's the older sister of Christianity in many ways, as Judaism is. We're all related, we're all in the same family. Walter Hooper wrote of Lewis's concept. He viewed paganism not as an evil child, but rather as a ragged and wild, but essentially good uncle of Christianity. Such reasoning makes sense from a man who first experienced, as he said, the stab of joy through pagan myths, and later found his way to God in Jesus through those same myths. It's almost as if C.S. Lewis lived out in his one lifetime the great history of paganism's longings, as expressed in paganism's myths, and then found in its fulfillments in the historical person of Jesus Christ. Of course, it only makes sense that the man who so loved this myth, who felt myth was absolutely central to faith, would continue then, of course, to explore myth in his writings on his own. Love that picture. Lewis said, to be truly Christian, we must both assent to the historical fact and also receive the myth, fact that it has become, with the same imaginative embrace with which we accord all myths. The one is hardly more necessary than the other. A one who disbelieved the Christian story as fact, but continually fed on it as myth, would perhaps be more spiritually alive than the one who just assented and didn't think much about it. See what he's doing there? Interesting. I think that last phrase really gives us insight into his writings in the Chronicles of Narnia, because Lewis really desired his writers to experience the magic and the love that is there in Narnia. Mark Bain writes about Lewis, one of his books. He says, if Lewis could present a Narnian version of the incarnation, he would have a forum then to articulate some of his most precious feelings about God. And he could do so without the law or without religious duty, without hypocrisy entering into the equation. It had been Lewis's personal experience that had made it hard to feel the way one ought to feel about one's God. What made it hard was the sheer fact that there were feelings he thought he ought to have. And he refused, and then Lewis talks about all these oughts, or the shoulds, as we would say. I should, I ought to feel this or be this or do this. And Lewis talked about oughts as being dragons. The oughts are our dragons. With Aslan, Lewis had a tabula rasa. He could enjoying the reader to feel love and devotion without that suffocating sense of duty, of the oughts that I have to love. You just fall in love, right? With Aslan. He could convey his own great gratitude and love for God without sermonizing. He could, as he once put it, steal past those watchful dragons. But Lewis was also making the claim that one must approach the Christian faith with this imaginative embrace with which we accord almonds, right? And he's speaking here, I think, really just that childlike faith that Jesus calls us to have, right? Whoever does not receive the kingdom of God like a little child, he said, will not enter it. Lewis just goes right for that idea, right? We must enter into this myth, into this story as children, with that sense of magic and love and hope. Both C.S. Lewis and J.A.R. Tolkien sought to bury these truths, these spiritual gems into their stories. I mean, they really are just wrought through with theology, right? Tolkien's is a lot more subtle than Lewis. Lewis is actually criticized for that. Like, oh, it's too obvious. But I think their model, in a way, was Jesus' model. He was a storyteller. That's what Jesus did. He buried his truths in the parables. Right? Think about that. The storytelling has a way to convey deeper truths that are harder to convey in other ways. So what then are the Chronicles themselves? And I have to tell you, there's so many books he wrote, but I love the Chronicles. So I'm just going to focus on this for the last part of our talk. I think the best answer comes from Lewis himself. He claims that they're not allegories to be decoded, but he calls them supposals. Let us suppose there was a land like Narnia, and that Jesus, as he became a man in our world, became a lion instead. And then imagine what would happen. Lewis begins this book with the four children, of course, who have been separated from their parents. They're sent to a home in the country to stay with an old professor in order to be kept safe during the Nazi air raids of World War II. Of course, that is exactly what was happening in C.S. Lewis's own life, right? He is the old professor himself, living in the country, and children came to stay with him during the war. And while they're there, he started writing these stories for the kids there in his house. That's why he started this. He wanted to try to entertain them. And many of the characters and scenes from the stories originally came, he says, to him in his dreams during that time. He felt like God was kind of speaking to him, like, here's a story. And those stories eventually become the books. He loved, he respected, he enjoyed children so much. He really felt that adults should treat children as equals, could learn from them. Like I mentioned, he had this incredible ministry of letter writing. He would correspond with children and their families for years. I mean, this wasn't just like he'd write a letter and be done. He had this lengthy correspondence going back and forth. And he'd often discuss his next book with the children in his letters, in his letter writings. And he'd ask the children for their opinions and their insights and what he thought he should do in the books as he continued through the series. He brought children's ideas into it directly. Yes, right. You'll notice that in the Chronicles, adults are really rarely present. And if they are, they're kind of like the bad guys. Like the White Witch and Uncle Andrew. The children themselves, who are the heroes of the stories, like the magician's nephew or Uncle Andrew, deceived by lust for magic, but young Diggory, little boy, is wise enough to see through it, right? I love that line when Uncle Andrew says, men like me who possess hidden wisdom are freed from common rules, just as we are cut off from common pleasure. Ours, my boy, is a high and lonely destiny. And then Diggory thinks to himself, all it means is that he thinks he can do anything he likes and get away with what he wants. So the children have to conquer their fears and their sins and exhibit faith and courage, strength, and wisdom necessary to battle the powers of evil and reign as kings and queens of Narnia. This is no doubt an allusion to the kingdom of God, in which ordinary children, people like you and me, have to go to battle, right? And in order to be part of God's kingdom and enjoy what the Bible calls the crown of life. So magic is a central theme. You see it throughout his writings and of course in the series. But it's interesting. He's definitely making some theological allusions to magic because he talks about the deep magic, right? Aslan knows an even deeper magic than the witch, right? But a lot of these folks fail to comprehend the deeper magic. But do you remember how does Aslan demonstrate the deeper magic? What does he do? What does he have to do? He has to die, right? He has to actually give his life. And so of course then he's raised from the dead. And he just weaves an interesting tapestry of the story of the Bible into the Narnia series. Okay, I know we're almost out of time and I want to give time for questions. Let me read this quote from the magician's nephew, because you hear echoes of the Genesis story from the Bible, I think, in it, through the pagan characters. Out of the trees, wild people stepped forth, gods and goddesses of the wood. With them, fauns and satyrs and dwarfs. Out of the river rose the river god, his naiad daughters, and all of these and all the beasts and birds in their different voices, low or high, or thick or clear, replied, "Hail, Aslan, we hear and obey. We are awake. We love. We think. We speak. We know." These pagan characters come from Greek mythology and are part of this important history and story. As he's writing the Chronicles, he was again getting input from kids. And a writer had asked him some questions about the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, that book. And Aslan says in that book, he says, "I have another name. You must learn to know me by that name too. This was the very reason why you were brought to Narnia, that by knowing me here for a little, you may know me better there." So the 11-year-old girl from the US writes to him and she's like, "Well, what is Aslan's other name?" But Lewis will be direct. He says, "As to Aslan's other name, I want you to guess. Has there ever been anyone in this world who arrives at the same time as Father Christmas? Who said he was the son of a great emperor? Who gave himself up for someone's faults just to be jeered at and killed and came to life again? Sometimes talks about is spoken of as a lamb. Do you know his name in the other world? Well, think it over and let me know your answer." And then in The Magician's Nephew, we learn that Aslan is not only the ruler of Narnia, but also the creator. And Lewis starts to bring in the idea of other religions, also conveying God's truth, not just Christianity. Lewis wrote, "I couldn't believe that 999 religions were completely false and the remaining one true. Now, we are not," he says, "pronouncing other religions to be false. We're just saying that Christ, in whatever way is true in other religions, is consummated, perfected in Christianity." So it's interesting. He has this kind of interesting distinction that he wants to make. Anyway, I have too many notes here and we're running out of time. So I'm going to stop there and ask, what do you think makes Lewis so appealing and influential? What maybe for you, or what have you seen? Because his influence continues. What do you think it is? What does he do that really seems to capture us? Or if you have a question to pass. Yes.
It's interesting that he's able to look at other faiths and realize that people can believe in those faiths. However, for him, somewhere along the line, he is realizing again that is his faith, and that's okay. So he can accept that there might be other people that believe in other faiths, but for him, he is accepting of Jesus. And so that is a pretty expansive thought, if you would.
It is.
So I mean, that's that encompasses virtually everyone.
Yeah.
Which is what he was almost trying to weave, it appears, that there is a God theoretically, and however you get there is okay.
Is okay. Well, and because he's atheist for so long. He's so sympathetic with the atheists that he understands why you would feel that way, right? I mean, yeah. And it's interesting because I think a lot of people struggle to how do we stay rooted in our own faith and still have that expansive view. Like I think Lewis models that well, of like, okay, other people have this other path. And anyway. Yeah, I love that. It is a hard balance. I think it's tricky, right? For some people to really figure that out. Other thoughts, other questions? I'll just open it up. Yeah,
I
Phyllis.
love that he dares to defy academia and just, he just is himself. He's very different from everybody else, and yet he continues saying his truth in writing and letters and on radio, and that voice. It's very unique, and he just keeps doing it. It becomes the next.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally defies academia and it's like, well, yeah, and he's still good. Yeah.
I think it's popular because for that reason, I think at the time, most famous British intellectuals were rather agnostic and left of center.
Yes.
And that's it's a modernist viewpoint at that time, but it's not widely appealing to people
Yeah.
to just be a materialist and say, oh, everything is just stuff. Just
Right.
atoms and subatomic particles, and it's just, we'll find out. We'll have an explanation for the supernatural, but only by hard scientific inquiry.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
not
that's
appealing-
really good.
That's not appealing to people,
Yeah.
because people have emotions, right?
Right. I agree. Yeah.
I would just say that I think he came to faith in an academic way.
Oh, he came to faith in an academic way. That's a good point. You want to say more about that?
So, I mean, I see that he was using his mind to inquire about atheism. What he believed.
Mm-hmm.
And I consider that the academic, that's the academic model.
Yes.
And he came through literature, but I think allowed him to look at maybe different ways of believing.
Right.
And I also think there was a lot of interest in the meaning of myth.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, in the 50s, 60s.
Yeah. Yeah, and so it was his interest and engagement with myth what allowed him in a way to think kind of beyond, yeah.
I mean, certainly.
So the academic
the
structure.
friends he had that he was able to engage with must have been a huge part.
Yeah. Yeah, people you really respect, intellectuals themselves and have faith, right? Yeah, with intention. Yeah.
Is there a C.S. Lewis museum or
A
where
museum?
all the letters have been saved or?
I saw it in Wikipedia, something like that. There was a library, something.
Is there? I don't know. We should look it up. A library or something with his writings. Yeah, I mean,
all
a
those
lot have
letters,
been-
all those letters,
yeah, all those letters.
who saved them and where did they go?
And I know a lot of them have been published, and I know you can also access quite a few online. But I don't know if there's
Some place where
yeah.
somebody can
Mhm.
find them.
Yeah, that's pretty, yeah. Yeah.
My personal experience with this was that my children were not introducing my grandchildren to any kind of religion.
Yeah,
And obviously, it's very important to me. And by reading these, it gave them hopefully an idea of something that was just beyond the here and now.
yeah. I think you're right. That's good. Yeah, isn't that
I
interesting?
love them.
Well, I think we're at time.
Rebecca,
Yeah.
I just want to say, is this the last time you'll be teaching?
Yeah, this is my last adult ed.
Well, I want to just mark that and to say what a great way to go out and pack room. And many of us here really appreciated your teaching over the years. And thank you for all that you've done and contributed to our adult education.
Thank you. So, my sermon today is about why you should read the Bible. So I'm ending adult ed with why you should read C.S. Lewis. All right, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.